we've got some brand new Final Fantasy VII Re-Trilogy news. Hamaguchi has been doing a ton of new interviews for the Switch 2 release of FF7R, and we are looking at a very interesting article. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth did not have DLC, and this is probably for the better, because Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, one of the most feature-complete video games I've ever seen. Now, yes, it is a remake that only has a third of the original game story, plus or minus. However, in terms of the overwhelming amount of content, the overwhelming amount of features, combat, it basically is its own standalone mainline Final Fantasy, and arguably goes way above single player FFs in terms of the amount of content that it has, in terms of the quality of the game. It's mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing. Again, that's why I would call it one of the most feature-complete games of the past generation. And here they're talking about DLC from Rebirth. What's interesting is that they did have some ideas for DLC for Rebirth, but they decided not to pursue them. So here is what the interview says. The interviewer asked, are there any plans for a DLC to bridge the gap between Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and the third title in the remake project, similar to Final Fantasy VII Remake Integrate? Hamaguchi saying, there were definitely some ideas to create a Rebirth DLC, and that was planned at a certain point in time. But when we revisited this topic and we thought about what our priorities should be and what fans are looking forward to the most, we figured that what fans want the most is to bring the third installment as soon as possible. That would take priority over the Rebirth DLC, so we decided to take that approach. With that being said, once we release the third installment, there is a possibility of a DLC for that third installment. With the conclusion of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, there's probably going to be a much wider audience for Final Fantasy as a whole. Whether we bring another new DLC or a full title, that's something we are actively considering. So the first part of this statement is not too crazy, right? In fact, I'm pretty sure we've heard it before. They didn't want to work on DLC for Rebirth because they wanted to go immediately into delivering us Part 3 as soon as humanly possible, and I would say that was the correct decision to do. Because between getting a Rebirth DLC and getting Part 3, I would rather just have Part 3. What is brand new is this second paragraph here, where he's basically saying, yes, we are considering DLC for Part 3, which is actually pretty nuts to even hear anything about, considering that Part 3 has not even officially been announced yet. But what I think is even more crazy, even more insane, is this part right here, Chad. Or a full title. So this is kind of worded a little bit ambiguously to me, because it can be read either way, right? It can be read like we are considering Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 4, or it can be read that we need to follow up with a new Final Fantasy, right? Like a new full Final Fantasy title. Because as we read this, as we look at it again, it says, with the conclusion of the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy, there's probably going to be a much wider audience for Final Fantasy as a whole. That's an interesting statement. And then he says, whether we bring another new DLC or a full title, that's something that we're actually actively considering. I don't think it means Part 4. Don't think it means Part 4 either. I think it could mean Final Fantasy 17, right? There's two ways of reading this. There's like, bring another full new title, Final Fantasy 7, bring a full new title, Final Fantasy. You know what I'm saying? Like, and it's lumped with DLC, which I think can make you initially think, does he mean Final Fantasy 7? Feel like he means Final Fantasy 17. If it were FF17, I feel like he'd word it differently. It's possible. I want it to mean Final Fantasy 17, but I don't think he means that. I want him to mean that is Final Fantasy 17, right? But it could read either way. I don't think it means Part 4. Do you know how many fans will be upset to learn about a whole other game while the expectation was just to have the conclusion with the third part? I'm going to say something I don't know if you'll agree with, and I know FF7 fans won't, but once FF7 is done and whatever DLC it does or doesn't gets wrapped up, SC needs to leave the 7 IP alone for a good while for the health of the FF brand, the whole compilation, not just the 7 compilation. They need to get people who love 7 and the remake trilogy into their future FF projects as well. They cannot keep fracturing the brand into subgroups. Yeah, no, I actually do agree with you for sure there. I don't think that making more 7 is the best idea at the moment, right? I know that some people will say, and I firmly disagree with this, that like SC shouldn't have like even remade Final Fantasy VII. I think that's like nuts, considering that people begged for a remake of Final Fantasy VII for ages. And so I think it's absolutely ludicrous to assume that they shouldn't have done this. I think that there are different ways in which they could have evaluated how they approached doing it, for sure. Remaking Final Fantasy VII was something they had to do. But I do think after 3 parts, I'm good, man. I'm good. I just wanted to experience Final Fantasy VII at this level of like visual quality and gameplay spectacle, but I think I'm good. I agree. I don't like the FF7 hate and the FF7 fatigue people are getting. I love FF7, but I don't want people to hate it. So I think they should give it a long break before returning to it later, returning to it in some way. Yeah, that's how I feel too. You don't want to make people hate FF7 or be like, oh my God, I'm so tired of FF7 slop, right? You don't want to get people to that point. And part of the reason that this remake was so highly anticipated was because we waited for FF7 to come back for so long. Yes, SE made the re-trilogy because their core fans wanted it. They shouldn't have put that tech demo out so long ago. I enjoyed what we got, but yeah, let FF7 rest. Yeah, I think that now is the time to let FF7 rest. I think that I want part 3 to essentially be the thing that makes me feel like FF7 is complete. Complete is a terrible word. I just can't think of another word. But like the feeling of being at rest. Like this chapter of my life has been fulfilled. Oh my God, Labib Zahid. Oh my God. Thank you for the insane $50 super chat. God damn, brother. FF7 spinoff and tie it into FF10. Let's go. But DLC is really interesting, right? So let's suppose that they let's suppose they do something after Final Fantasy VII Return, right? Again, we're just tentatively calling part 3 that because it's gained some popularity within the community. So let's say after part 3, Return, they decide to make more content. I think the only thing you can do, whether you make it a DLC, whether you make it a full game, I would like for it to be a DLC because I think making it a DLC is like the only appropriate thing you can do, but they need to make Final Fantasy VII Advent Children into playable content. Whichever way they want to approach it. I think if you want to send off Final Fantasy VII, ultimate way, make it feel like the 7 re-trilogy is the most complete FF7 experience that you can ever have in your life. You want to replay Final Fantasy VII, you want to experience the world of Final Fantasy VII, this is the thing to do it. The thing that would make my teenage dreams complete. Make Advent Children into playable content, into a DLC that you can get after part 3 drops. And that will generate so much hype that I actually do think that people who haven't been checking out the Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy might actually get wind of it because I think it will make people go insane. I think that playable Advent Children, only thing that you can do after part 3 that would make people go crazy. I don't think that people would go super crazy for Dirge Remaster, like some people would pick it up, but I think the thing that everyone would want the most would be Advent Children as playable content. I would rather it be a DLC because I don't think we need more than 5 or 10 hours to make Advent Children a full playable thing. I think a full Advent Children game is overkill. I think it's just too much. I mean, it would mostly be new game, right? Because you're taking like, you know, you look at Advent Children Complete, which is like, I think like 2.5 hours, maybe 2 hours, something like that. You look at Advent Children Complete and making that into a, you know, like a 40-hour game is just absurd. I could see them doing 2 short DLCs, one for Advent Children and one for Dirge with the new epilogue tying off whatever the going on with Genesis. That would also be interesting. See, I wouldn't mind them doing Final Fantasy VII too, but the fact that we got a trilogy of the first game has kind of turned me off of FF7 too. Again, it kind of makes me go back to the idea that maybe this should have just been 2 games and then a 3rd game that comes out that is Final Fantasy VII 2, like an actual proper FF7 2. Probably would have been a better approach than doing a remake trilogy and then try and see what you can do after FF7 is over. There's also some other stuff in here. If fans asked for it, would you consider a standalone Queen's Blood game to be a priority? And Hamaguchi says, as I mentioned in my previous response, the utmost important right now is to work hard towards the third installment, make sure it gets released as soon as possible with the highest quality achievable. Right now, the solo Queen's Blood title is probably not in the list of priorities. We actually haven't determined any priorities after the release of the third installment, so things are really up in the air right now. If there is enough demand, a solo Queen's Blood title is definitely something we can consider. Obviously, they're still working hard on part 3. However, the idea of getting a solo Queen's Blood is not out of the question. I think people would definitely play it. That is the type of mobile game that I want to see get announced. Maybe less Dissidia Duelum and more of Queen's Blood mobile game arc. I think I would actually be way more into like playing multiplayer Queen's Blood with people than I would be anything else like Final Fantasy mobile related. So I know you guys love talking about this one. This is the talk of the town. Is the future only action-based? I think he gives a fairly standard answer here, but not only does he give that answer, he also talks about Expedition 33. The interviewer said, before closing our interview, I wanted to know what Hamaguchi feels about the future of the series outside the remake trilogy. The main Final Fantasy titles have abandoned the classic turn-based combat for many years now, basically to attract new players. But Square Enix hasn't stopped releasing turn-based games, like the Octopath series or the most recent version of Final Fantasy Tactics. I bring Claire Obscure Expedition 33 as an example of a turn-based game that has attracted many Western players, and ask Hamaguchi whether he thinks the main FF titles might come back to the series' roots. That's an interesting question, he says. As you mentioned, FF7 Remake and FF16 are both action-based RPG designs. Essentially, for the main numbered Final Fantasy series, the game design is based on the director's decision himself. For the new title, whether it's action or turn-based, that's not predetermined yet. If you would ask me, is my next game going to be an RPG? There is definitely a possibility. Is it going to be a turn-based RPG? We're taking this aside from the fact that Expedition 33 was well received. We received a lot of JRPGs are back comments. I'm thinking about I'm thinking about what experience fans will enjoy. That's the most important point. He says down here, I'm not just going to make a game and say, I'm making a turn-based game or I'm making an action game. It can go either way. What's most important is finding out what game design will appeal to the fans. Very interesting. If you would ask me, is my next game going to be an RPG? Yes, there's definitely a possibility. Brother, I know because you're working on Final Fantasy VII. I know it. I'm going to keep gaslighting myself and telling myself that. I know it's true. So Hamaguchi says the same as Yoshi P, at least they're consistent in that regard. They aren't ruling out turn-based, but they're definitely not saying that they're going to do turn-based. I think that if you have expectations that Final Fantasy XVII will be turn-based, I think that you have misplaced expectations. If there will be another turn-based Final Fantasy game, that would probably be Final Fantasy XVIII. The reason being is that Final Fantasy XVII is likely already in some form of development and being worked on in some capacity at this point, and probably does not fully factor in everything that has happened in recent years in the same way. Why do you want Hamaguchi on 17? I do too, but why do you? I just think he's done like a really good job on the 7R games in terms of not only getting them out the door, but making them play in the way that I think is a true modernization of classic FF for the most part. And that's not to say that it can't be better. It can definitely be better in like a lot of respects. But I think he is the only one kind of punching in the right direction right now. I feel like they are going to do something entirely new and won't keep re-trilogy combat. They don't have to necessarily keep re-trilogy combat so much as like, I just want them to keep the basic idea. You hit an enemy and that builds up an ATB bar. And then you can open that ATB like command menu and select commands, and you can switch party members. That's really the only things that I want them to keep, and they can do literally anything else. They can make it feel different. They can add a jump button. Any other thing they want to do with it, they can do with it. It can basically make it feel completely different in a lot of ways. But I just want them to keep the core idea of you are charging an ATB bar and You use that to open a command menu, and of course you can switch party members. Anything else they want to add or subtract or play around with, if they don't want to keep the stagger bar again, they want to swap the stagger bar out for something else, if they want to do this, that, and the other, I'm so cool with it. Bring in something new. I just want them to keep the element of commands, and I want them to keep the element of multiple playable party members. And I think as long as they have those things, those basic things, and the feeling of like, you know, doing light puzzle solving while in combat and doing, you know, elemental weaknesses, that type of stuff. Basically, like the stuff that you expect from Final Fantasy gameplay. While it changes from game to game on how it gets presented, it's still there. Like the core concepts are still there. I think about like Final Fantasy 12 and 13, and while there are a lot of people who don't necessarily like 12 and 13, 12 and 13 still have all of the like elements there in the combat system. They're still very much identifiably Final Fantasy in terms of the way that they work, in terms of their overall design scheme, even though they're radically, you know, departures from the way past systems were presented, they still ultimately kind of aren't, especially 12. 12 is still, I mean, you could really argue that 12 isn't even a departure at all. It's just, you can literally just walk around and you don't have to hit the attack button anymore. But 12 is still very much identifiably FF to me, right? But they did a lot of interesting, cool things with 12 that added a lot to the overall formula of Final Fantasy, and that's all I want them to do. Which is why, you know, when I present this idea to some people and they always say like, oh, you just want more FF7. I'm like, no. I don't want it to be more FF7. I want it to just have a core identity that we all know of as Final Fantasy, that we can all point to and agree. And when you list these elements out, everyone is in agreement. Yeah, that's the thing. And you could do anything with those things, right? Like you could take a magic system anywhere. You can do anything with party members and how different party members play. You can do anything with status effects and elemental weaknesses and play around with them. Status effects in Final Fantasy X don't look the same as the ones in Persona, and using elemental weaknesses in Final Fantasy X doesn't look the same as it looks in something like Persona either, right? So you can play around with that any way you want to and build a fundamentally new game, but as long as those core elements are there, I think it will ultimately feel like Final Fantasy. So this is about the creation of Final Fantasy VII Remake's hybrid system, and this is what Hamaguchi has to say about that. He was asked during the Brazilian Game Show 2025, Screen Rant had the opportunity to sit down with Naoki Hamaguchi and talk a bit about his work on the Remake trilogy as well as his influences. One of the most notable aspects of Re-Trilogy is its revamped and renewed combat system. While the original game only offered turn-based combat, the new titles add real-time action mixed with turn-based elements. Hamaguchi tells me that the creation of this system doesn't stem from a single source of influence, and in fact leans on the Final Fantasy series rather than solely external sources. I have to pause. I do not think that it is, you know, a sin for them to use influences outside of the Final Fantasy series. But with this being said, I also don't understand why the Final Fantasy series isn't used more often for inspiration for a lot of the modern titles, right? Like, I don't know. I think that they need to focus on actually modernizing and bringing up to date Final Fantasy and not trying to think about this genre and that genre. And this is what's popular now, and this is where things are moving, and this is what we need to do in order to catch up. I think they just need to think about like what Final Fantasy games have traditionally been, and I don't think that they've actually been that different. If you look at Final Fantasy 1 through all the way up to 13, there is like a very consistent through line of common elements of what people consider Final Fantasy. It is not like Final Fantasy has just always been completely random different thing. Even with 12 and 13, which were very experimental games, still a lot of the common FF elements were there. They changed them, they did different things with them in attempts to appeal to new people, and you can certainly argue back and forth on whether those things worked or not. But there is like a incredibly clear through line that you can look at and say, okay, this is what Final Fantasy games have traditionally done. And so I don't understand why they look at kind of like, you know, say like 15 and 16, that they suddenly think that people just don't like the core aspects of Final Fantasy anymore. I don't mean the core Final Fantasy audience either. I mean that I believe that Final Fantasy as it is can appeal to new people, or not as it is, but like Final Fantasy, the core identity, the core experience of this being a party-based RPG with different characters that you can play as, and the way in which Final Fantasy has a unique way of moving throughout its worlds and exploring those characters and the types of systems that people expect. I think that they have not reached the cap of how many people really would enjoy those systems. And furthermore, their existing fans also still yearn for a return of games that feel that way. So I just don't understand why there is like this necessity to pursue so much external influence. Again, not to say that they can't use external influence. They can definitely use external influence. It's just that I feel like a lot of that external influence sometimes comes at neglecting the Final Fantasy influence. And then yeah, even with people saying like, oh, they need to make Final Fantasy 17 like Expedition 33. I don't think that Final Fantasy 17 needs to be like Expedition 33, but I do think it's funny because saying that Final Fantasy needs to be like Expedition 33 is basically just saying that Final Fantasy needs to be Final Fantasy, because Expedition 33 is literally just them copying Final Fantasy's homework. Like, that's all it is. All you're saying with that is just like, you wish the newer titles were more like classic FF. Like, that's all you mean. Like, it's not a really profound statement to say that. I get what you mean by that, but all you're really saying is that you just want the world map back. And when you say, I want it to be like E33, we're not getting the world map back faster by you saying that. We would get it back faster by you just saying, I want the world map back from Final Fantasy. You know? So I don't think it's that you want Final Fantasy to be Expedition 33. You just want Final Fantasy to be FF, right? Like, you just want them to go back to their sauce. E33 is a love letter to a lot of old school JRPGs, but in particular, a lot of old school Final Fantasy games. And yeah, it's not that FF needs to copy E33. It's just that FF should do the FF thing, which is what E33 did, right? It also did the FF thing, but people want FF to do the FF thing too, right? I think that's all that really is. So again, I do think our words matter. The devs do read what we say. The higher ups also read what we say. We should send clear message. It's not that we want them to copy this small French studio, because by the way, how is that? Like, I think what people are actually asking for when they say that is a terrible thing. Like, they're asking for like... Let's suppose that Square did copy E33, right? Like, that would be like so up, because it's like this big multi-billion-dollar corporation coming in and copying a small French studio and being like, yeah, we made our new thing. And I don't think that's not what people want. People just want... But I get why people say it, but it's not the way we should communicate what they should do. Yeah, and that's another thing too, is that SE can't really copy Sandfall, because Sandfall was inspired by Squaresoft. You know what I'm saying? They were inspired by what Final Fantasy was doing previously, right? And they noticed that there really wasn't anything that was quite like FF7 through 10, so they decided to make their own game that was kind of a follow-up to that style, Final Fantasy, right? But like, Square wouldn't be copying E33 if they tried to do something like that. They would just be doing what they did. Hamaguchi tells me that the creation of the system doesn't stem from a single source, and in fact leans on the Final Fantasy series rather than solely external sources. The foundation of it all is the original Final Fantasy VII, a turn-based game. However, we do draw inspiration from many action-based games that require you to think tactically about how you battle and position yourself, he explains. Hamaguchi goes on, the stagger system was pulled from Final Fantasy XIII. Curiously enough, Hamaguchi worked on Final Fantasy XIII. The game director acknowledges that the reason why the hybrid combat mechanics in Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy work well is because of Teruki Endo, the game's battle director. Most of Endo's career is centered around action-based games, cites Hamaguchi. For reference, Teruki Endo's first credited work is as a game designer on Resident Evil 5, though he is best known for working as the lead game designer on 2018's Monster Hunter World, which is a somewhat tactical action-based RPG. In Capcom's game, you have to think thoroughly about the weapon type you're using, and more than anything else, timing and positioning. This can be seen in the Final Fantasy VII Remake Series 2, though to a smaller extent. Hamaguchi concludes that Indo's presence as the battle director for the remake trilogy is exactly what Square Enix's team needed. I believe that finding the balance between the original game's turn-based system with Indo's expertise in action-based combat is what made Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat system so beloved by players. They drew from Final Fantasy internally rather than seeking out a ton of external influence, which again is not bad at all, but I don't think that their primary influences should be, if we want to make a game like X game that is not even a Final Fantasy. I think that their influence and their motivation should always be that we are trying to make a Final Fantasy game and we're trying to evolve what Final Fantasy is. We may take influence from other titles in order to make Final Fantasy thing, but we're not just gonna go into a completely different genre, emulate something that is definitely explicitly not FF. I'm telling you, those elements are still really popular. People still really care about them. So this is about the kind of padding in Rebirth and whether Rebirth is reflecting on how the hybrid combat system was built. Hamaguchi punctuates that he and Square Enix team have a clear vision of how the remake trilogy will proceed. While the games in this series have been praised, there is some level of criticism toward them. There are complaints about how the story differences in Final Fantasy VII Remake are handled, and how some portions of the game, like Costa del Sol, feel so long and drawn out. Really? Costa del Sol? I mean, I guess. Yeah, somewhat. Yeah, I can kind of see it. That's not the part of Rebirth that I feel was truly drawn out. Temple of the Ancient is the part that I feel was drawn out. It just did not need to be this long. Holy crap. What are you doing? Temple of the Ancients. Yeah, I was fine with Costa del Sol. I was a little surprised, but I can kind of see it because you have to go around playing all those mini games and things. I can kind of see it. But Temple of the Ancients, dog, that's where I started to lose my mind a little bit. It took everything in me to just to not deduct a little bit off of the game because of how long Temple of the Ancients was. And a lot of it was just the same handful of enemies in a small area. Nah, the Cave of the Gi was bad. I don't think my problem with Cave of the Gi was that it was placed in such a fundamentally wrong section, because it was yeah, Nanaki, shut the hell up. The Gi are talking now. So the pacing in that section was a little weird. It did not leave enough room to breathe. So to this, Hamaguchi replies, regarding time management in certain areas, in certain sections, especially in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, I honestly don't believe that they were longer than necessary. I feel like nowadays, players just have too much to do and too much to play, so they often feel that urge that something has to be concluded quickly. Even if he doesn't agree with the claims, the game director does mention that this feedback is being taken into account for the upcoming Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. As we work on the conclusion to the trilogy, we are striking a balance on how the story arcs are told and spread out so as to ensure that the game feels a bit more concise. Yeah, I mean, he's not wrong when he says that, players are there's too much shit to play and people want stuff to conclude, and also that attention spans are shorter than ever, and so a lot of stuff feels longer than it needs to be. It's also true that I do think that a lot of older games, just in general, a lot of older RPGs were a lot more snappy about how they got from point A to point B. So I think it's a combination of things for sure.